Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Matt, a nature and wildlife photographer based in Northern California. And today I wanted to talk about the Fujifilm X-S20 and specifically the settings that I'm using for wildlife and primarily bird photography. I haven't seen that much out there on the internet about using this camera body, this small, fairly reasonably priced camera body as a wildlife camera. You see a fair amount of information out there about the X-H2S, which makes a lot of sense as a stack sensor. It's very appealing for processing wildlife information and processing that data quickly. But you also see people talking about the X-H2 for its croppability, or even the X-T5. But this camera, at really half the price of the X-H2 and X-H2S options, is an interesting option for wildlife photography. And I'll share with you why before jumping into the settings that I'm using. So this camera is really nice because it has this solid grip, which makes it nice for holding longer lenses. Like, for example, the Canon EF 500mm f4 right back there, which is what I use primarily for wildlife photography. It also is a smaller sensor camera at 26 megapixels, which is maybe a downside for croppability, is a downside, but is also kind of an asset when it comes to reading information. And what I mean by that is that a camera that's 26 megapixels is able to process that data much faster than a camera that's 40 megapixels given the same processor. And we can liken this to maybe reading a book. And if you're looking at a page of text, if that page has 40 lines of text, it's going to take you longer to read that full page than a page that has only 26 lines of text. And that's essentially what the processor is doing when it's reading through the information on a sensor. So we have less rolling shutter on this camera than, say, the X-T5 or the X-H2. And we also have perhaps a faster readout speed. And readout speeds are helpful when it comes to things like autofocus calculations. So that's why I think this camera is actually kind of an interesting option for wildlife photography. So with that, I want to jump into the settings that I'm using for wildlife photography. And I'm going to screen share here so you can see, and we'll walk through the menus, and I'll just sort of talk through some of the specific changes I've made and why I've made them. And hopefully it's helpful to you out there when you're shooting with this camera or other Fujifilm offerings and doing wildlife photography. All right, so I just to talk through a couple things here with regard to image quality and things that I think probably folks are pretty familiar with. You know, I shoot RAW exclusively. Sometimes I'll shoot RAW and find JPEG, which would be this setting if I'm using a film simulation, for example, that I like for wildlife photography. I shoot lossless compressed as opposed to uncompressed RAW processing because it's lossless, so you're not losing anything, but you are gaining a little bit of space. I like classic chrome as a kind of default, though I would say that I actually think Pro Neg High is kind of nice for wildlife photography. The contrast is really nice, even though it's designed as a portrait simulation. But of course, we're shooting RAW, so we can mess with things after. I do like the color chrome effect. I mean, again, these things kind of are debatable whether you want to include them. For white balance, I shoot white priority. Again, kind of you can mess with that. These are sort of my default settings here. For the tone curve, I like kind of the fall off with the highlights and shadows. So I do adjust those a little bit here. But these changes are not really that relevant if you're shooting RAW because we kind of edit the images afterwards. All right, well, this is really the main deal, and this is kind of what I wanted to focus on, no pun intended, and that's the AFMF, or the autofocus settings. And I think this is where you can really tweak the Fuji to perform a little bit better in the field than the defaults. Okay, so the first thing to think about here is maybe the focus mode. So I think it's fairly obvious, but we want to be in continuous autofocus. And that's because in a wildlife situation, things are moving pretty quickly relative to, say, landscape or cityscape or things like that. Whether that's a bird in flight that's moving quickly across the screen, or the field, and you want to be kind of autofocusing as it's moving, or whether that's even just a bird kind of perched as that head is moving around and kind of like, doing little bird things and stuff like that. It's actually moving and it's active and it needs continuous autofocus. If we just locked focus here and then the bird did its like bird things and stuff like that, it would fall out of focus pretty quickly. So because of that, continuous autofocus is sort of the name of the game. Now, once you're in continuous autofocus, the next question is, what AF mode are you going to use? Now, with AF mode, we have single point, zone, wide tracking, and then all is just a combination of those. I used single point a lot when I got started. And the reason why I use single point is because of this. If you switch to single point, you will note that the number of focus points is higher. Now it's 425 focus points. More focus points means the camera can be more fine-grained in where it's acquiring focus, and it can do a better job getting the subject, and specifically, in this case, say the eye of the subject. So leaving it in single point does give you this versatility of more focus points, and that is an asset. When you switch to zone, you'll note that the number of focus points has dropped to 117, and it is fixed. It is grayed out. We cannot mess with it. And this is just a feature on the X-S20. It may be an issue with other cameras as well. I wish this wasn't the case, and I think it's something Fuji does need to improve upon in the future, making those maximum number of focus points available in all settings. But as it is, this is the trade-off. You shoot single point, you shoot zone, you're going to have fewer points if you're in zone. Now, why do I shoot zone, which is what I choose to shoot? Well, I shoot zone because I want a single configuration on the camera where I can take a photo of a bird that's perched on a tree, and then I want to be able to quickly take a photo of that bird as it leaves the perch and goes into the air for a bird in flight shot. I don't want to mess with the preset. I don't want to change and toggle to a different setting here. I just want to be able to take that shot and immediately transition my focus, my shooting technique to capture a bird in flight. And the best way to do that I've found is to run a zone autofocus with subject detection. The subject detection is useful when the bird is stationary, when it is sitting in a tree. That's when I'm using subject detection. I'm using that to try to get the eye, and I found this camera does pretty darn well, even compared to my Canon equipment, to be able to find the eye and to take that shot. But then once the bird's in flight, if you're in single point, now you're in trouble because you need to get that single point right on the bird. And so zone, as a default, when you fall back to the other, if it's not able to detect the subject, zone is a much better option for that bird in flight. So that's why I use that. Now, there is a scenario where I'd wish that we could have single point as well. And that's a scenario where a bird it's stationary, but it's say in a bush or something like that. And the subject detection is not effective at identifying the subject. So in that situation, zone is going to probably focus on the bush because it's the closest thing to the camera if the bird is sort of tucked in. That's when you want to have a really small single point to be able to use your joystick and put it on the eye. And so that's kind of the downside is I'm sacrificing the ability to do that in favor of being able to catch the bird in flight. And I think that's okay because this camera does pretty darn well at identifying subjects. And I'm typically able to kind of like maneuver in a way that I can get the subject detection to work and be able to execute that shot when I'm in zone, but with subject detection. Okay, so we've covered focus mode is autofocus. We've said zone AF is the default. The zone area I'm using is this sort of smaller version. That's typically what I'm using. However, when you tweak, when you're in this setting, if you use the wheel, which is where your thumb is, you can change the size. This is the largest option. This is medium and this is small. I use small because I'm fairly experienced and I'm able to maneuver in the field or move the autofocus area using the joystick like this to get my subject. If you are a beginner, I would recommend doing either large or medium. The downside to these is that, if there's a bird in flight and there's a tree, and you're in the large setting like this, it's pretty easy for the bird to be flying and the tree to be there and for the zone to get kind of tripped up on which subject it wants to detect. So in that situation, I think it's better to have the smaller one because you're more likely to get your subject and only your subject in the zone in this case. All right, so we've covered all of those. Now, the kind of next thing I want to mention, the most important, I think, is the AFC Custom Settings. Now, this is where you might see a big difference. So the settings I'm using are 6, which is custom. So you can go through all of these using your joystick and you can kind of work through all of those. But I have this custom setting set up here, and I'm specifically using the locked on setting, which is 4. You can see here I've toggled it all the way to the right, which is locked on. So what I want here is I want the autofocus to acquire the subject, and I don't want it to get messed up by anything else. If there are trees, if there's anything like that, I want it to hold that subject and keep it. And because it's doing a pretty good job acquiring the subject, that's kind of working out okay. So the next thing I do here is I change the subject sensitivity. Now, this is interesting, and this is something you can play with. So I found that when I do 2, it's a little too jumpy. So it's looking for the subject to move, and it's anticipating that the subject's going to move quickly, and it's wanting it to, in a sense. So the AI is trying to find that subject moving. Steady is like, it's predictable. So, think bird in flight, just moving through the sky, right? So as you're panning, AF is anticipating it's going to move, and that's okay. I think steady or 1 has performed better for me. I had it set to steady 0 because I was shooting birds in flight today, but probably leaving this on 1 is reasonable. And then there's this option here. So I have this set to center. The idea here is to move it away from auto. Moving it to front means it's going to focus on the thing that's kind of closest to the camera. I don't think that's that useful for birds in flight or even birds in general. There's almost always something that's kind of in between you and the subject. So I want it to default, because I'm using zone, back to center to try to find in the center of the zone where the subject is, because I'm pretty good at keeping the subject in the center of the camera focal view, or whatever you want to call it. So those are the custom settings I'm using for autofocus. As we mentioned, you're kind of forced into using 117 points for autofocus. And then I have subject detection typically on, and I have it set to birds. Now, this is going to be an issue if you're shooting mammals. You would want it set to animals, but I leave it set to birds. Now, what am I doing that's kind of interesting here that makes it a little bit more useful? Well, what I'm doing, if you hold down the display back button on the back of your camera, you're going to get a menu, and that's this menu here. And this allows you to customize buttons. And let me explain to you why this is really cool. So it's these 2 buttons right here. So I use dual back button focus in a sense. Back button focus means, if for those of you who are new to it, that we're going to focus using the back of the camera using AF on. That's going to tell the camera to acquire and lock focus. We're not using the shutter. So we're not using the button that you push to take the picture. That is deactivated. And instead what we're doing is we're using the back button to take the shot. And the advantage to this is you really disentangle, or you disconnect the process of executing a shot with acquiring autofocus. And this is helpful for situations where, for example, you're having trouble focusing on the subject. And what you really want to do is pump autofocus. You want to try to acquire the subject. The subject detect is not getting it, or maybe you want to give it a break. You want to try zone. You want to switch back to subject detection. You want to do all of that, and you don't want to have to be toggling buttons the entire time and using your shutter to try to execute it. You want to be able to have a dedicated button for all of those functions, and that's where something like the back button focusing is really helpful. So what I do is I have AF on switched here to the AF on button. And then what I've done is for the AFL, which is the button right next to it, I've switched that to toggle subject detection on and off. So think about what this is doing. It's saying when subject detection is on, like I have it set here, it's going to be trying to find the eye, and it's going to be focusing on that point. But when I push that button AEL, or I turn that off, it's now defaulting back to the autofocus option I've set, which is zone. So for a subject in the bush, where I'm trying to take a photo of it, I'm using subject detection, I'm taking that shot. The second that lifts off and goes into flight, I'm toggling that off and I'm defaulting to zone. I'm able to capture that subject as it's flying through the air. That's how it's working for me, and I find that to be incredibly successful compared to the default option of using the shutter or trying to toggle with single points or things like that. So the only thing to mention there is in order to make the back button focusing work, and you can kind of search this on YouTube elsewhere, you're going to want to turn off the function to have the shutter. You're going to turn off AF on the shutter, and that's something you can find here in your menu. And if you go down here to the wrench, these are all, it's annoying that they're all kind of in different settings. You go to button here and you go down here and you find a shutter AF, and you turn this to off. And you want this off for AFC and AFS to deactivate the shutter for autofocus. So those are my settings, and that's what I'm running. And I hope that's helpful to you. I found this to be pretty useful and to work pretty well. I'll be doing more videos in the future. So like this if it was helpful for you, and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. I'll see you later. Take care.